The terminal was buzzing with activity as passengers made their way to the private jet hangar. Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in a simple black hoodie, gray sweatpants, and his signature size 22 sneakers, stood in line, towering over everyone. Despite his massive stature, Shaq blended in effortlessly with the casual setting, carrying himself with an easy grace. Nearby, Mark Henderson, a sharply dressed executive in his early 40s, adjusted his gold cufflinks and checked his Rolex. Mark's tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes screamed wealth, and his air of superiority was impossible to miss. As the passengers boarded the luxurious jet, Mark noticed Shaq ahead of him. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smirk. "Guess they're letting just about anyone on these flights now," he muttered to no one in particular, though his voice carried far enough for Shaq to hear. Shaq turned his head slightly, catching Mark's smug gaze. Instead of responding, he offered a polite nod and continued up the steps of the jet. This simple reaction seemed to unsettle Mark, who thrived on confrontation and validation. Inside the jet, the cabin gleamed with opulence. Plush leather seats, crystal glassware, and personalized menus awaited each passenger. Shaq quietly chose a seat near the back, away from the larger groups, and nodded politely to the flight attendant. Mark, however, strode in with a swagger, scanning the cabin for the most prominent seat. He chose one near the front, where everyone could see him, and made a show of settling in, adjusting his tie and glancing around to see who was watching. As the last passenger boarded and the cabin door closed, Mark leaned back in his seat, his eyes darting toward Shaq. "Did someone win a radio contest to get a seat here?" he said, loud enough to elicit a few chuckles from other passengers. Shaq remained unbothered, pulling a book from his backpack and flipping it open. This non-reaction seemed to irk Mark further. For someone used to dominating conversations, Shaq's calmness felt like a subtle dismissal. The flight attendant walked through the aisle, offering refreshments. When she reached Shaq, her demeanor softened, and she greeted him warmly. "Mr. O'Neal, it's a pleasure to have you on board again. Can I get you anything?" "A bottle of water, please," Shaq replied, his tone polite and measured. Mark overheard the exchange and rolled his eyes, leaning toward the passenger beside him. "Mr. O'Neal? Really milking it, huh? All this for a bottle of water?" Despite the murmurs and stares, Shaq remained composed, his focus entirely on his book. For him, the flight was just another moment of quiet reflection, a stark contrast to the bubbling tension emanating from Mark. As the engines roared to life and the jet taxied down the runway, Mark glanced back at Shaq one more time, his mind already formulating ways to assert his dominance over the unassuming man sitting quietly at the rear. This wasn't just a flight for Mark. It was a stage for his ego, but he had no idea that the lesson awaiting him would challenge everything he thought he knew about status, success, and respect. On board the private jet, the atmosphere was a blend of luxury and exclusivity. The plush leather seats, polished wooden finishes, and soft hum of the engines created a serene environment, but beneath the surface, tension was brewing. Mark had chosen a prime seat near the front, ensuring he was in full view of the other passengers. He casually leaned back, sipping champagne from a crystal flute, his every move calculated to display his wealth. His gold watch glinted under the cabin lights, drawing glances from a few nearby passengers. Shaq, in contrast, sat near the back, his large frame almost comically out of place in the seat designed for regular-sized passengers. He had a book in hand, its well-worn cover suggesting it had been read multiple times. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more apparent. Mark's arrogance radiated, while Shaq's humility quietly commanded respect. Mark, however, wasn't content to let the quiet endure. He turned in his seat, pretending to stretch, and then addressed no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like they're letting just about anyone on private jets these days. Guess exclusivity isn't what it used to be." Several passengers exchanged glances, some amused and others uncomfortable. Shaq, however, didn't look up from his book. His calm demeanor seemed to dismiss Mark's words without needing to respond. Irritated by the lack of reaction, Mark decided to up the ante. He rose from his seat with exaggerated purpose, casually strolling down the aisle until he was just a row away from Shaq. "Mind if I sit closer? You seem like you could use some company," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Shaq looked up, his warm eyes meeting Mark's icy glare. "Sure," he said simply, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. As Mark sat down, component placement. He placed his champagne glass on the table with a deliberate clink. "So," he began, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers, "what do you do for a living? Must be nice to hitch a ride on one of these." Shaq smiled faintly and replied, "I stay busy." The response, vague and unassuming, only irritated Mark further. Used to commanding attention with his stories of success, he pressed on. "Busy, huh? Doing what? Let me guess, personal trainer, or maybe an assistant for someone important?" Shaq's smile didn't falter. "Something like that." The calm, measured responses frustrated Mark, who was accustomed to others vying for his approval. He leaned back, deciding to take a different approach. "Well," he began, his voice rising, "hard work pays off, you know. I run a company with offices in 3 countries. It's taken years of dedication to get here. That's the kind of grind it takes to sit in a seat like this." Shaq nodded, his expression unreadable. "Hard work is important," he said. "So is staying humble." Mark chuckled dismissively, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Humility doesn't pay the bills," he retorted. A nearby passenger, a young woman seated with her laptop, glanced up and frowned at Mark's words. Others exchanged knowing looks, silently rooting for Shaq as the underdog in this unspoken battle of values. Meanwhile, the flight attendant approached Shaq with a warm smile. "Mr. O'Neal, would you like another water?" she asked. "Thank you," Shaq replied, handing her the empty bottle. Mark scoffed quietly, leaning closer to the passenger beside him. "Water? Really milking the luxury experience, huh?" As the flight continued, the contrast between Shaq's humility and Mark's arrogance became increasingly clear. Passengers who initially seemed disinterested now subtly observed the dynamic, their curiosity growing. Despite the prodding and provocations, Shaq remained unshaken, his demeanor calm and composed. He wasn't playing Mark's game, and that refusal to engage on Mark's terms only made the businessman more desperate for validation. What Mark didn't realize was that Shaq's patience wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. And soon, the reason for that strength would become evident, leaving Mark stunned and questioning everything he thought he knew about success and respect. The private jet hummed steadily as passengers settled into their routines. Some tapped away on laptops, others reclined with headphones, savoring the tranquility of the flight. But in the middle of it all, Mark was determined to break the calm, his words cutting through the quiet like an unwelcome disruption. Mark shifted closer to Shaq, his tone feigning casual conversation but laced with patronizing curiosity. "So? What's your secret, man? Did you win a contest to get on this flight? Or maybe you know someone in high places?" Shaq looked up from his book, a calm smile tugging at his lips. "No contest," he said simply. "Just here to enjoy the ride." The lack of elaboration only fueled Mark's irritation. "Enjoy the ride," he echoed with a chuckle, leaning back in his seat. "Well, I guess everyone's got their way of doing things." Mark wasn't finished. He folded his arms, a smug grin playing on his face. "You know," he said, glancing around to make sure he had an audience, "private flights like this are for people who've earned it. It's not just about sitting here. It's about belonging here." Nearby passengers began to exchange uneasy glances, sensing the tension but unsure whether to intervene. A woman with a tablet paused her typing, her eyes darting between the 2 men. An older man seated across the aisle adjusted his glasses, his frown deepening. Shaq, however, remained unfazed. He closed his book gently and turned to Mark with a serene expression. Belonging isn't about what you wear or how much you show off, he said. It's about how you treat others. Mark laughed sharply, his voice louder than necessary. Is that so? Because in my experience, being humble doesn't exactly pay the bills. He gestured around the cabin, as if the jet itself were proof of his superiority. This, he said, this is the result of hard work, ambition, and making sure people know what you're worth. Shaq's smile didn't waver. And what are you worth? He asked softly, his tone calm, but his words sharp enough to silence Mark momentarily. The question lingered in the air, heavier than the luxurious furnishings of the jet. Mark's face tightened, his confidence faltering for just a moment before he recovered. I'm worth success, he said, his voice rising slightly. That's why I'm here. What about you? What makes you think you belong? Shaq leaned back, his large frame almost dwarfing the seat. I'm just here to enjoy a peaceful flight, he said. Mark scoffed, his frustration bubbling over. He turned to the passenger across the aisle, shaking his head as if to say, Can you believe this guy? But the man only raised an eyebrow, before returning to his book, leaving Mark to stew in his growing discomfort. The flight attendant returned, carrying a tray of refreshments. She stopped at Shaq's seat, her smile warm and genuine. Mr. O'Neal, she said, placing a perfectly arranged plate of fruit and nuts before him. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Mark's brow furrowed. Mr. O'Neal, he muttered under his breath, glancing at Shaq as if seeing him for the first time. Shaq offered the flight attendant a polite nod. Thank you. I'm good for now. Mark's eyes narrowed, suspicion beginning to creep into his expression. He watched as the attendant walked away, then turned back to Shaq. You must be someone important, he said, his voice edged with sarcasm. Maybe I underestimated you. Shaq chuckled softly. Maybe, he said, picking up a piece of fruit from his plate. As the flight continued, the atmosphere grew more charged. Passengers who had initially dismissed the conversation now leaned in, curious about the unfolding dynamic. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, and Mark, who had started the exchange feeling like the dominant presence, now seemed increasingly out of place. But this was only the beginning. Mark had yet to realize just how much he had underestimated the man sitting across from him, and the revelation that awaited would leave him utterly stunned. As the jet cruised at 40,000 feet, a sense of unease began to settle over Mark. The lavish surroundings, the polished wood finishes, the soft leather seats, the quiet hum of the engines had once felt like his domain, a stage for his self-proclaimed superiority. But the presence of Shaquille O'Neal, calm and unbothered, now cast a long shadow over his inflated ego. The first crack appeared when the pilot's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to thank you all for flying with us today, and a special thanks to Mr. O'Neal for his continued support of our airline. Mark, who had been mid-sip of his champagne, froze. His grip on the glass tightened as he glanced sideways at Shaq, who was flipping through the pages of his book, as if the announcement had nothing to do with him. The flight attendant approached Shaq moments later, a warm smile lighting up her face. Mr. O'Neal, she said, we've prepared your favorite dish. Please let me know if there's anything else you'd like. She placed a steaming plate of perfectly cooked salmon in front of him, garnished with fresh herbs and a side of roasted vegetables. Thank you, Shaq replied with his signature smile. This looks amazing. Mark's unease deepened. He shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his watch, but his mind raced. Mr. O'Neal, he thought. Why does that name sound familiar? Before he could dwell further, a boy of about 10 emerged from one of the rows up front, his eyes wide with excitement. Clutching a basketball magazine, he approached Shaq hesitantly, as if stepping into the presence of royalty. Excuse me, sir, the boy said, his voice trembling. Are you Shaquille O'Neal? The basketball player? Shaq looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin. That's me, he said warmly. The boy's face lit up and he held out his magazine. Could I get your autograph, please? Of course, Shaq said, taking the pen the boy offered and carefully signing his name. You play ball? The boy nodded enthusiastically. Yeah, I'm a point guard. My dad says I should watch your games to learn how to dominate on the court. Shaq chuckled, handing the magazine back. Your dad's a smart guy. Keep practicing and one day maybe I'll see you in the NBA. The boy beamed, thanked Shaq, and hurried back to his seat, clutching the magazine like a treasure. Mark, who had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort, leaned forward slightly. He opened his mouth to say something, but stopped himself. The name Shaquille O'Neal now rang like a bell in his head, each syllable resonating with familiarity and disbelief. He replayed the events of the past hour in his mind. The flight attendant's deference, the pilot's announcement, the boy's awe. Pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed began to click into place. Could it be? Could the man he'd been mocking be the Shaquille O'Neal? Mark tried to rationalize it away. He's dressed too casually, he thought. Why would someone that famous fly with us instead of a private jet? But no matter how hard he tried to dismiss the possibility, the evidence stacked against him. The older gentleman seated nearby, who had been quietly observing, leaned toward Mark with a knowing smile. You don't recognize him, do you? He asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Mark hesitated. I think I do now, he stammered, his confidence faltering. The man chuckled. That's Shaquille O'Neal, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, and a philanthropist, and a successful businessman. The list goes on. Mark's face flushed with embarrassment. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the gazes of the passengers who were now whispering among themselves. Shaq, still seated with his book, appeared entirely unaware, or perhaps completely uninterested, in the unfolding realization around him. His composure remained unshaken, his calm presence a sharp contrast to the growing storm within Mark. Mark leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. What have I done? He thought. I've been treating a global icon like a nobody. Worse, I've been outright insulting him. As the flight attendant returned to check on Shaq, Mark couldn't help but blurt out, Excuse me? Can I ask you something? The attendant turned to him with a polite smile. Of course, sir. Mark gestured toward Shaq, his voice hushed. Is he really Shaquille O'Neal? The attendant's smile widened. Yes, sir. Mr. O'Neal is one of our most valued clients. He's invested in our airline and flies with us regularly. Mark's stomach dropped. The reality of his behavior hit him like a freight train. He had mocked and belittled not just a man, but a legend, a man who clearly outranked him in every conceivable way, yet carried himself with unmatched humility. And the lesson wasn't over yet. As the jet began its descent, the tension in the cabin was palpable. The passengers, now fully aware of Shaquille O'Neal's identity, whispered among themselves, exchanging hushed amazement at his humility. Mark, however, sat in his seat frozen, replaying every condescending remark he had made. His face flushed with embarrassment, the sting of his arrogance now unmistakable. The pilot's voice broke through the cabin speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing for landing. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Mr. O'Neal for his continued support of our airline and for always making these journeys memorable. Mark's head snapped up, his heart sinking further. This was no coincidence. The man he had belittled wasn't just another passenger. He was a central figure to the airline itself. The flight attendant approached Shaq once more, her tone reverent. Mr. O'Neal, your usual car service will be waiting for you on the tarmac. Please let us know if there's anything else we can arrange. Shaq nodded graciously, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Thank you. Everything's been great as always." Unable to contain his curiosity or his rising panic, Mark leaned forward and cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can I ask, who are you exactly?" The flight attendant, standing nearby, glanced at Mark with a faint smile. "This is Mr. Shaquille O'Neal, sir. He's one of our key investors and a frequent flyer on our private routes." The words hit Mark like a thunderclap. His earlier remarks now replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. The jabs at Shaq's appearance, the condescending questions, the veiled insults about wealth and status. He felt the weight of every one of them, heavier now with the knowledge of who Shaq truly was. "Wait, you're the Shaquille O'Neal?" Mark stammered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Shaq turned to him with a polite smile. "That's me," he said simply, his tone warm but tinged with finality. The cabin erupted into a low murmur as passengers pieced together the significance of the revelation. Some turned to Mark with barely concealed smirks, while others exchanged knowing glances. An older couple nearby shook their heads, the wife whispering, "How could he have been so rude? The man's a legend." Mark, his bravado completely shattered, leaned back in his seat, his face pale. I didn't know," he muttered, almost to himself. Shaq's expression softened, but his words carried weight. "It's not about knowing who someone is," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about treating people with respect, no matter what you think you know about them." Mark's embarrassment deepened. For a man who prided himself on his status and achievements, being humbled in front of a cabin full of witnesses was almost unbearable. Yet, he couldn't deny the truth in Shaq's words. As the plane touched down, the reality of the situation fully sank in. Passengers began to gather their belongings, but the focus remained on Shaq, whose towering presence commanded respect without effort. Mark, meanwhile, sat quietly, grappling with a mixture of shame and regret. As the jet came to a stop and the cabin doors opened, a car awaited Shaq on the tarmac. The flight attendant escorted him out with a respectful bow, her words a testament to his impact. "Thank you again, Mr. O'Neal. It's always an honor having you with us." Before stepping off the plane, Shaq turned to face Mark one last time. "Take care of yourself, man," he said, his tone sincere. "And remember, respect doesn't cost a thing." Mark could only nod, his throat dry, as Shaq disappeared down the jet's steps. The other passengers filed out slowly, many casting looks of admiration toward Shaq and judgment toward Mark. Left alone in the cabin for a moment, Mark slumped in his seat, staring at his reflection in the window. For the first time, he saw himself not as the successful businessman he had always imagined, but as a man who had let arrogance cloud his humanity. As Shaq descended the steps of the private jet, his imposing frame exuded a calm confidence that needed no announcement. The luxury car waiting for him on the tarmac was sleek and understated, a reflection of the man who had spent the last few hours teaching an unexpected lesson without ever intending to do so. Inside the jet, Mark remained seated, his mind racing as he struggled to process the events of the flight. Every dismissive comment he had made replayed in his head, now laced with shame. The weight of Shaq's parting words, "Respect doesn't cost a thing," sat heavily on him, a simple truth that pierced through his carefully constructed image of superiority. Summoning his courage, Mark stood abruptly, determined to say something, anything, that might set things right. As he made his way toward the exit, the murmurs of the other passengers followed him like a trail of judgment. Their looks, once admiring, now carried the sting of disapproval. When Mark stepped onto the tarmac, he spotted Shaq leaning casually against the luxury car, chatting with the driver as though they were old friends. It was a scene that starkly contrasted with Mark's earlier assumptions about Shaq. a man so unassuming yet so undeniably influential. Mark approached cautiously, his posture a mix of hesitance and regret. "Mr. O'Neal?" he began, his voice quieter than it had been all flight. Shaq turned, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Yeah? I just wanted to say," Mark faltered, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were and I judged you unfairly. That wasn't right." Shaq studied him for a moment, his towering frame somehow non-threatening despite the quiet power he radiated. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his tone even. "But like I said, it's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people when you don't know who they are." Mark nodded, his face flushed with genuine remorse. "You're right. I've spent so much time trying to prove myself to stand out that I forgot what really matters." Shaq smiled faintly, his gaze softening. "It's not too late to change, man. We all mess up. It's what you do after that counts." The sincerity in Shaq's words cut through the noise in Mark's mind, planting a seed of self-reflection that would linger far beyond the conversation. As the driver opened the car door for Shaq, the basketball legend paused and turned back to Mark. "Take care of yourself," he said simply. "And remember, success isn't about what you have. It's about how you treat others." Mark watched as Shaq climbed into the car and disappeared into the city, leaving behind more than just an impression. He had left a lesson, a blueprint for how to live with humility and respect. Back in the terminal, the other passengers couldn't stop talking about what they had witnessed. An elderly couple shook their heads in disbelief. "You don't see that kind of humility every day," the husband remarked. The young boy who had asked for Shaq's autograph tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be like him," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Like Shaq?" his father asked, smiling. "Yeah," the boy replied. "Kind." It wasn't just Mark who walked away changed that day. Every person on that jet carried with them a reminder of what true greatness looked like. In the days that followed, Mark found himself replaying Shaq's words over and over. He realized that his relentless pursuit of wealth and status had blinded him to the value of humility and kindness. Slowly, he began to make changes, not for appearances, but because he genuinely wanted to be better. Mark started treating his employees with more respect, taking time to listen to their concerns and recognizing their contributions. He even reached out to local charities, donating his time and resources to causes he had previously overlooked. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Shaq continued to lead by example, using his influence to uplift others without seeking recognition. Whether through philanthropic work or simple acts of kindness, he embodied the principle that respect and compassion were the true measures of success. For Shaq, the flight was just another journey, one of many in his busy life. But for Mark, and everyone else who had witnessed the encounter, it was a turning point, a moment that challenged them to rethink what it meant to be successful and how they measured their own worth. As the private jet passengers filed out into the terminal, the weight of what they had witnessed lingered in the air. Conversations buzzed in hushed tones, as though the lesson imparted on that flight was too profound to discuss loudly. Shaq's words and actions had sparked a ripple effect, leaving everyone who witnessed the exchange to reflect on their own behavior and values. The young boy who had approached Shaq for an autograph tugged on his father's hand as they walked toward baggage claim. "Dad, why didn't that man treat Shaq nicely at first?" His father paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some people think what's on the outside is what matters most," he said. "But Shaq showed us that true greatness comes from how you treat others." The boy nodded, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I want to be like Shaq when I grow up." At a nearby luggage carousel, an elderly couple who had observed the interaction on the jet shared their thoughts. "I've flown first class for years," the husband said, adjusting his hat. and I've seen plenty of egos in my time. But that man, Shaq, he's different. He doesn't need to brag or prove anything. His wife nodded. It's not just what he said, but how he said it. No anger, no judgment, just calm wisdom. I wish more people understood the value of humility. Mark lingered in the terminal, standing off to the side as the crowd began to thin. The noise of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements faded into the background as his mind replayed the events of the flight. Shaq's words had struck a chord he couldn't ignore. Respect doesn't cost a thing. Mark sighed, the weight of his arrogance now fully apparent. His life had been a relentless pursuit of wealth, status, and power, but for what? He realized that in trying so hard to prove his worth, he had overlooked the very essence of what it meant to be successful. The seed of change planted during the flight began to take root. Mark vowed to approach his life differently. He would focus less on appearances and more on actions, less on accumulating wealth and more on building meaningful relationships. For the rest of the passengers, the flight wasn't just a journey from one city to another, it was a lesson in humanity. The cabin's air of exclusivity had been transformed into a space for reflection and self-awareness. Days later, the story of the flight began to spread. Some passengers shared their experience with friends and family, recounting how a global icon like Shaquille O'Neal had reminded them of the importance of kindness and humility. The tale reached social media, where it quickly went viral. Comments poured in, praising Shaq's ability to rise above arrogance and embody true leadership. Among the many who heard the story was a local school teacher who shared it with her students during a lesson on character. "What do you think made Shaq so impactful?" she asked. A young girl raised her hand. "Because he didn't fight back with anger. He stayed calm and showed the other man how to be kind." The teacher smiled. Exactly. It's not about winning an argument, it's about showing people a better way. Shaq, however, remained unaffected by the buzz surrounding the story. To him, the events of the flight were just another opportunity to live by his values. He had no interest in the limelight or accolades. His focus was on using his platform to inspire change in others, one interaction at a time. For Mark, the lesson wasn't fleeting. He started making amends in his life, treating his employees with more respect and focusing on meaningful connections rather than flaunting his wealth. He knew the road ahead would be long, but he was determined to follow Shaq's example. As for the rest of the passengers, they left the terminal with more than just luggage. They carried with them a story that would stay in their hearts, reminding them that true greatness isn't about what you have, but how you treat others. As the private jet taxied to its final stop, Shaquille O'Neal rose from his seat with his usual calm demeanor, giving a polite nod to the flight attendant, who had treated him with such warmth throughout the journey. Passengers in the cabin hesitated as they gathered their belongings, sneaking glances at him with a mixture of respect and admiration. Mark, however, sat frozen in his seat, his mind replaying the series of events that had unfolded mid-flight. The words Shaq had spoken echoed in his thoughts. It's not about who you are or what you have. It's about how you treat others. For someone who had built his entire identity around status and wealth, those words felt like a quiet revolution in his soul. At the terminal gate, passengers began filing out, but not before a few stopped to express their gratitude to Shaq. "Thank you for the lesson," one woman said softly, clutching her purse. Shaq responded with a warm smile and a simple, "We're all here to learn from each other." Mark finally gathered the courage to approach him, his usual arrogance stripped away. His voice trembled as he said, "Shaq, I owe you an apology. I was wrong. The way I acted wasn't right, and I hope you can forgive me." Shaq turned to face him, towering in stature yet radiating humility. "Apologies are the first step, Mark," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "The next step is how you change moving forward." Mark nodded, his face a mix of regret and determination. You've taught me something I'll never forget. Thank you for that. Shaq smiled and extended a hand. We're all here to grow, my friend. Don't stop working on it. The two men shook hands, a brief yet profound gesture that seemed to cement the lesson of the day. As Shaq walked toward the exit, he declined offers for interviews and photos from waiting media personnel. This wasn't about public recognition for him. His actions weren't for applause. They were simply the way he chose to live his life. In the corner of the terminal, the young boy who had asked for Shaq's autograph watched the exchange with wide eyes. Turning to his parents, he declared, "I want to grow up to be like him." His father smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Then remember what he showed us today. It's not about being the biggest or the richest. It's about being kind and true to yourself. Mark watched Shaq leave, his figure disappearing into the bustling airport crowd. For the first time in years, Mark felt lighter, as though he had shed a weight he didn't even know he was carrying. He stood quietly for a moment, vowing to be better, not just in business, but in every interaction he had going forward. The flight had ended, but the impact of what happened on board rippled far beyond the cabin walls. Every passenger left with more than just their belongings. They carried with them a story of humility, kindness, and the realization that true greatness lies in how you treat others. The story closes with Shaq stepping into his waiting car, looking out at the terminal as the sun begins to set. He smiles to himself, knowing that the day's events had planted seeds of change, not just for Mark, but for everyone who had been on that plane. The lesson was simple but eternal. Greatness isn't about wealth or status. It's about the legacy of kindness you leave behind.